G'day ladies and gentlemen, how you're doing? Scotty49 here with you once again for another installment in the How to Play Warhammer 40,000 series. Now, this is the 11th video in the series. We've hit double digits and we're continuing to go through the phases of the game as well as the main rules of the game, the different ways to play the game and how to build army lists and what's involved. Now, as I said, this is the 11th video of the series and we're going to be jumping into the fight phase this video. Now, before we go any further, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank everyone that's subbed so far. As of recording, we are one sub away from hitting 100 subs on YouTube, which is an awesome milestone. I want to thank each and every one of you. And we're going to do something special for it as well once we hit that 100. But if you haven't already, feel free to hit the subscribe button down below as well. And without further ado, let's jump into it. Alrighty, so the fight phase is actually broken down into two different stages. The first up is ordering combats and the second is resolving combats. So we're going to start off with going through what it means when I talk about the ordering of combat units. So there are several different elements involved in this part of the fight phase, especially once you start to add certain abilities that units in close combat might have, such as always fights first or always fights last, or if they've charged that preceding charge phase. And we're going to break this down so you get a good understanding of this straight away, so there's no confusion, but if there is, you can always ask questions down below. If there are any units that have made a charge this turn, or are under the effect of an ability or have a rule that allows them to always strike first, those units are able to be selected to fight before any other units. So, it means your charging units will always get to fight first, and then anyone with the rule of always strikes first gets to fight first as well, which is awesome. If both yourself and your opponent have got units that fall under this stage, then you alternate between each player, starting with the player whose turn it is. So it means if you've got, say, 3 units that have charged, and your opponent's got 1 that has got the always fights first rule, what will happen is you'll go with one of your charged units, then their always fights first unit go, then your other 2 charged units. That's how that part of the ordering of combats work. So after you've done all the eligible units at that point, then any units that didn't charge this phase or are under the effect of both a always fights first rule and an always fights last rule can be selected to fight. Again, at this stage, you do still alternate between yourself and your opponent. However, it does differ that you start with the player whose turn it is not. So you start with your opponent. Then, once you've gone through all of those units, if there are any units that are under the effect of an always fights last ability or rule, you still resolve them last, and you alternate between each player, starting with the player whose turn it is not, if you've both got models and units under the effect of an always fights last rule. So you can see that there's a bit of difference there when it comes to units that are always fighting first and starting off with the player whose turn it is, and then if there's no one that's charged or there's always fights last, it starts with the players whose turn it isn't, and they're generally referred to as the defending player. So that's pretty much it for the ordering of combat. That can get a bit tricky, but that is the simplest way that I can put it for you guys. And as I said, if you've got any questions specifically about that, let me know down below in the comments. Now, we're going to jump into the second part of close combat in the fight phase, which is resolving combats. So once you've selected your first unit to fight with, you have to fully resolve each of the following steps before selecting another unit. You have to do the pile-in, the making attacks, and consolidation steps before going on to another unit. So what the pile-in step is, the unit that is selected to fight is able to make a pile-in move, which is a 3-inch move that must end closer to the nearest enemy model. However, if the model that you're wanting to move is already in base-to-base contact with the closest enemy model, it cannot move because it can't get any closer to that miniature. That's pretty much that step done. The next step is the fun step, which is making attacks. However, before any dice are rolled, you will need to determine which models are actually able to fight in this step and how many attacks they're going to make and against what target unit they will be targeted at. Any models that are within engagement range of an enemy unit can fight. However, they can only make attacks against the enemy unit if they are within half an inch of that enemy unit or within half an inch of a model that is within half an inch of the enemy unit. Now, I know that can be a bit complicated, but pretty much it means that if you've got 3 rows of models back and they're 5 deep into another unit, then the first 2 rows, if they're in base to base, first row will be able to strike, second row will be able to strike, and the third row will not be able to attack. To kind of give you a bit of a clean example, each model is able to make a number of attacks based on their attack's characteristic, which is denoted by A on the unit's profile. Now, before making any attacks, you must choose a target for every model in that unit that is able to fight and make attacks against a single enemy unit. And you must resolve all the close combat attacks against one enemy unit before moving on to resolving attacks against a second enemy unit. So say you've charged 2 units simultaneously, you have to resolve attacks against one before you resolve the attacks against another. When you go to make close combat attacks, for each model that is making an attack here, you need to choose a melee weapon that it's going to make it with. If a unit does not have any melee weapons to be able to make attacks with, then it's considered to have a relatively simple close combat weapon. So this can be a combat knife for Space Marines, or it could be the blade on the front of a Gorse Flayer or a Gorse Reaper for Necrons. Actually, no, they're not on Gorse Reapers, but Gorse Flayers, you know what I'm referring to here. And they're defined as being strength user, AP 0, 1 damage weapons. Pretty straightforward. Now, if the model has got more than one melee weapon, however, you can then choose to split a model's attacks between them. So say, for example, you got a Vanguard veteran that's got a chainsword and a lightning claw. So say you want to split his attacks 1 and 1, so you'll generate the extra attack with the chainsword that it can only be used for the chainsword, and then you strike with the lightning claw with that's 1 attack and you get 2 with the chainsword, as an example there. If a melee weapon actually has multiple profiles, then you must declare which profile you are choosing to use before any melee attacks are made. If a unit is making melee attacks with multiple melee weapons, you must resolve all the attacks using the same melee weapon before moving on to resolving attacks with other melee weapons. So say, for example, you've got a 5-man unit of Vanguard veterans doing the same thing with lightning claws, chainswords. You've got to resolve either the lightning claws all first or the chainswords all first, and then resolve the other one before moving on to doing any other attacks. And that means that if you're putting, say, 3 Vanguard veterans into one unit, 2 into another unit, you've got to resolve the 3 for the chainswords, then the 3 for the lightning claws, and then the 2 for the chainswords or lightning claws, and then the other one. It can get a bit complex like that, but I hope that's a bit clear. So you kind of have to go resolve each weapon type first against the single unit before moving on to another unit, just so that that's nice and clear. And so when you are making these attacks and making the rolls, please refer to my previous video in this series that I did on the shooting phase, where I actually go through the process of making attacks, doing hit to wound, damage, armor saves, all that kind of stuff in that video as well. And you can find that information there. So after you've done all that and you've done all the attacks for that unit, you then get to do consolidation. What consolidation is that they get to make a consolidation move. So this is, again, another 3-inch movement that must end closer to the closest enemy unit. Now, it does not have to be the model that you are in close combat with, because if you destroyed that unit, then obviously something else is going to be closer to you than them. Now, there are tricks that people will use with both piling and consolidation to do some tagging of other units, so be very mindful of these 3-inch moves. Now, again, however, there is that stipulation. If the model's already in base to base with the closest enemy model, it can't. And that wraps up the fight phase, and we'll jump into the morale phase in the next video. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, well, I hope that you have enjoyed this video explaining the fight phase. It's probably a bit short and sweet, which is really good. I hope that I gave you a clean explanation on what's involved when declaring, what unit you're going to go with when ordering your close combat, and being mindful of that, knowing if a unit's there that you're engaged with that has always fights first, and you've charged them, you probably want to fight with your charging unit first, and being mindful of those kind of things, as well as briefly explaining how attacks are allocated and made in the fight phase, as well as the movements of both pile-in and consolidation as well that you do get. If you do have any questions, feel free to let me know down in the comments below, as well as dropping a like, and if you haven't already, feel free to subscribe to the channel as well to hit that 100 or higher sub count, which is always greatly appreciated. If you do have any comments and questions, let me know. If you don't want to ask them here, feel free to come by when I'm live on Twitch on Tuesday and Friday nights and Saturday afternoons, Australian Eastern Time, where we do hobby sessions, live games, and tournament coverage as well, and I'll do my best to answer them there. Or you can feel free to jump into my Discord, where I've got over 120 members in a great community where we're more than willing to answer any questions you have. So if I'm asleep, we've got people from all around the world that are able to answer those questions for you. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. I hope to catch you in the next one.